everyone. Thanks for being here with us today. My name is Holly Yang, and I am the Program Director of Diabetes Management in Ernest Meier Pharmaceuticals. Today, I'm excited to present our new drug, molybutide. Its brand name is Molygon. And Director of each key functional areas will be coming out and to go over the specific planning of the drug. Before they begin, I'll be going over the basic overview of Molygon. The pharmacologic class of Molygon is a GLP-1 analog. It works through stimulating increased insulin secretion in the pancreas and also decreasing glucagon secretion. The PK and PD values are seen as follows. Also, it has some side effects. It can cause GI complications, pancreatitis, and altered kidney function. It also has a black box warning. It is contraindicated in patients who has a family history of thyroid C-cell carcinoma. It also has drug interaction. It can reduce the rate and extent of absorption of orally administered drugs. Also, it is used in caution when it's used with insulin because of increased risk of hypoglycemia. The drug indication for Molygon, it is to improve glycemic control in adults with type 2 diabetes with an adjunct to diet and exercise. Also, we're planning to indicate for managing chronic weight in adult patients with the initial body mass index of 25 to 29.9. These are patients who are overweight, and BMI of 30 or above. These are patients who are obese. We are also trying to combine with insulin degludec and insulin glargine to limit weight gain. For dosing, it is in a pre-filled multi-dose pen available in doses of 0.5 milligrams, 1 milligram, or 1.5 milligram per injection. It is administered subcutaneously with once weekly administration. So that was the basic overview of Molygon. Now, before we go into the specific trials, let me briefly talk about what value pharmacists can bring to the clinical development sector in pharma. First of all, pharmacists have professional knowledge and background on drugs and know the clinical impact drugs can have on patients. Most importantly, pharmacists can effectively stage clinical trials because they are aware of different factors that play into drug noncompliance and take them into account to avoid any treatment failure. This can include patients' adherence to treatment, drug-drug interactions from existing medications, and other patient genetic factors or comorbidities that can impact the clinical trial. Now I will hand it over to Dr. Yu to go over the specific trials that we plan for Molygon.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Enoch Yu and I am the Director of the Clinical Development. I'm here today to talk about the clinical development plan. This includes one phase 1 trial, 2 phase 2 trials, 2 phase 3 trials, and a post-marketing study in phase 4. These trials not only highlight the safety of using this drug, but also highlights the efficacy of this drug when compared to current therapies today.
Here, we have the phase 1 clinical trial, MO-S1. This trial serves mainly to ensure the safety of the compound and the pharmacokinetic profile of molybutide. This will be a randomized, parallel, double-blinded study where patients will receive molybutide with their doses escalated or adjusted weekly. Here, the target population will be around 20 to 100 healthy individuals, and the trial duration will be about 20 weeks. Here, the primary and secondary endpoints is closely mirroring the safety profiles of current anti-diabetic therapies, as we want to make sure molybutide does not have any significant adverse effects that will endanger the patient. The primary safety endpoints include number of acute pancreatitis episodes, confirmed hypoglycemic episodes, thyroid C-cell tumor rates in patients, altered renal function, and depth. The secondary endpoints include GI symptoms, such as nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, and other cardiovascular risks, such as macrovascular risk, congestive heart failure, and atherosclerosis. For the phase 2, there will be 2 different trials. The first one here is the GON SE2A. This is to determine the optimal dose of molybutide. The patient population includes type 2 diabetes patients who previously had been treated with metformin therapy. This again will be a randomized, parallel, and double-blinded study, but with 4 treatment groups. Patients in each treatment group will be receiving the initial 0.5 milligrams of molybutide. Then, depending on which treatment group they're placed in, there will be different max doses set at either 0.5 milligrams, which is the initial treatment, so unchanged therapy, or titrated up to 1 milligrams, 1.5 milligrams, or 2 milligrams. This will help in finding the optimal dose of the drug and how it correlates with the efficacy and safety profile of molybutide. Here, the target population changes and includes patients with type 2 diabetes who have previously been on metformin therapy, but still have uncontrolled diabetes defined as HbA1c of greater than 7%. The study population here will be greater with 300 patients. The trial duration is also longer, listed at 26 weeks. We set this duration because the American Diabetes Association recommended HbA1c levels to be tested every 3 months, aka 12 weeks. Red blood cells will have a life cycle of about 100 to 120 days, so we wanted the trial to be long enough to withhold multiple life cycles of the red blood cell and to have a more complete evaluation of the changes in the HbA1c level. The primary endpoint will be the change in HbA1c from baseline, week 1, after the 26 weeks of treatment. For the secondary endpoint, we want to further evaluate the efficacy of molybutide and seeing the number of patients reaching a HbA1c level of less than 7%. Also, for the secondary endpoint, we're looking at a 9-point self-monitoring blood glucose level, so we can better monitor before meals, in between meals, and after meals glucose levels. In addition, we are also looking at other changes in laboratory measures, such as fasting plasma glucose levels, body weight. The safety endpoints will be similar to the ones in phase 1 and will include hypoglycemic episodes, cardiovascular events monitored by the ECG, and also other adverse events of special interest, such as increased pancreatitis, GI symptoms, depth, calcitonin, thyroid disease, and altered renal function. The second part of the phase 2, phase 2b, is the GON-SE2b trial. This trial is to compare molybutide to an active comparator, liraglutide. Liraglutide is a GLP-1a agonist that is commonly used as a next step therapy for patients who are uncontrolled with oral antidiabetics. Here, the study design is consistent with the 2a trial, and the target population remains the same, with patients who are type 2 diabetic and on metformin therapy. Here on this slide shows the trial design with half the patients adding on molybutide therapy, max dose set at 2 milligrams, or liraglutide therapy, max dose set at 1.8 milligrams. This will be added to their existing metformin therapy. The primary, secondary, and safety endpoints here stay the same as we want to stay consistent throughout the whole clinical development plan. Moving into the phase 3 trials. The first one, LOG1, will be comparing molybutide with 2 active comparators, insulin degludec and liraglutide. This is to show how molybutide compares to not just the GLP-1 agonist as seen in the phase 2 trial, but also the traditional insulin therapy. Again, here the target population remains consistent with type 2 diabetes patients inadequately controlled with metformin therapy. The trial duration here in the phase 3 trial will be longer at 1 to 3 years and will include a larger patient population of about 3,000 patients. This will help in evaluating the longer-term efficacy of the drug. The primary endpoint here, again, remains consistent at looking at the glycemic control, specifically HbA1c levels. We are also adding in an additional secondary endpoint of weight gain. Since this is an adverse effect of insulin-type products, we wanted to see how molybutide compares. Again, in insulin-type products, weight gain is commonly seen as a barrier for patients to adhere to the insulin therapy. Here in LOG2, we wanted to see how molybutide could do when it is not only added on to an oral antidiabetic therapy like metformin, but also for patients who are inadequately controlled on insulin therapy. Here in log 2, we have 2 treatment arms. Patients who have been inadequately controlled by their insulin regimen and cannot tolerate higher doses will be adding on either liraglutide or molybutide to their existing therapy. Here, the trial duration is consistent with the phase 3A trial, but will have more endpoints, one at 26 weeks, 54 weeks, 2 years, and 3 years. This will help us give more data points to look at and evaluate how patients are progressing in their treatment. This trial also helps evaluate the place in therapy molybutide is as an add-on therapy to patients with failed insulin therapies. The Phase 4 clinical trial will be a post-marketing study to gather additional information and insights about molybutide's safety, efficacy, and optimal dosing. The previous trials discussed are only on study populations, and this trial here in Phase 4 will show how molybutide is doing in the real world. The clinical trials here in Phase 4 will include FDA-required post-marketing studies, as well as investigator-sponsored research and observational studies. Here, the trials will have to continue monitoring the efficacy in lowering HbA1c and blood glucose levels, but also closely monitoring patient-reported adverse events. And up next, Dr. Minnie Zhang will be presenting on regulatory affairs.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Minnie Zhang and I'm the Executive Director of Regulatory Affairs. Today we'll be talking about the drug development process for our drug Molligon. During our regulatory process, the factors we'll look into include application filing and maintenance for preclinical as well as clinical trials, safety assessments, labeling and advertising validations, along with post-marketing surveillance. This is an overview of the FDA interactions. So there are 3 types of meetings with the FDA: Type A, Type B, and Type C. Upon basic research, it's important to schedule pre-IND meetings with the FDA, and this is a Type B meeting, which is scheduled 60 days from receipt. This requires briefing and preparation in advance, and it's usually used to answer concerns from the FDA. This is considered a milestone in drug development, and FDA may ask questions like, have appropriate animal models been used, and is toxicology data sufficient? So after this, the initial IND is submitted prior to phase 1 trials. The FDA will have 30 days to respond to find fault. So without fault, trials for clinical development may begin. During phase 2 trials, there's an end of phase 2 meeting is held. This is a type C meeting, which is scheduled 75 days from receipt. And it's held to address any concerns regarding our development process. And at the end of phase 2 trials, a Type B meeting is held to answer FDA inquiries. The first step in IND filing is to first request a pre-IND meeting, and we must wait 14 days for an FDA response. So once the request for the pre-IND meeting is approved, all the materials are prepared a month in advance. This meeting is a chance for the FDA to kind of critique our drug development data. After 30 days, the FDA will send meeting minutes and recommendations for the project, and once these are reviewed, a final IND submission is submitted to the FDA. So we must wait another 30 days before the FDA approves or denies. Once this is all approved, phase 1 trials in human may begin. For the US-focused NDA filing strategy, first it is important to have a pre-NDA meeting to uncover major issues and identify studies intended to establish the drug safety and effectiveness. Another is to discuss the status of pediatric studies. And finally, it's important to discuss appropriate statistical analyses or results. Also, an NDA meeting is held after the clinical trials phase 2 meeting and during the conduction of phase 3 clinical trials. Once this is done, the original NDA can be submitted. This must demonstrate efficacy with acceptable safety in well-controlled studies. Product labeling should be generated to also define appropriate population and measures for safe and effective use. There are pivotal trials to support approval, and first it includes the preclinical trials, which involve the animal studies to examine safety of dose and duration for planned human studies. The next include the clinical trials to observe the human pharmacokinetic and bioavailability. Several clinical endpoints will be observed, including the primary endpoints. These are the specific events of interest, which include overall survival, heart attacks, and viral load. It's important to examine the overall decrease in the baseline HbA1c for type 2 diabetic patients, along with the decrease in baseline body weight. The secondary endpoints include safety, time to progression, and quality of life, and also occurrence of hypoglycemic events. Additionally, comparative efficacy research will be conducted to compare Molagon to an existing GLP-1 agonist therapy that is used to treat type 2 diabetic patients. This to observe the reduction of ADRs along with enhancement of patient compliance. This ties in with the previous slide, and that comparative analyses with other GLP-1 agonists is crucial for this expedited program. Our drug Molagon meets the qualification for breakthrough therapy. It's used to treat a serious condition, which is type 2 diabetes, which if left untreated can lead to other serious diseases, including neuropathy and heart attacks and atherosclerosis. In terms of the process, it's important to submit a request along with the IND, ideally no later than the end of phase 2 meeting. The primary intent of this breakthrough therapy is to ultimately develop evidence needed to support approval as efficiently as possible. The goal for this expedited program is for priority review, accelerated approval, and fast track status. The best thing about pharmacists is that they can offer unique perspective in advertising and promotion because of our clinical and pharmacological insight during protocol development and review. Additionally, with our knowledge on drug development process and the sciences behind it, we can employ our drug information expertise, and we can comprehend scientific and statistical analyses. Now I'll introduce you to Dr. Dan Chen, the Director of Medical Affairs.
Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Dan Chen. I'm one of the directors for the Medical Affairs Department, and today I will be talking about some of the processes that we have planned for Medical Affairs and for our new product Molagon. Alright, so first we're going to talk about the composition of our Medical Affairs team. Our team will be made up of medical science liaisons, medical communications and publications, medical information experts, health economics outcomes research, and medical direction and operations officers. So medical science liaisons, their function will be to disseminate pertinent information and build relationships with leading healthcare professionals and key opinion leaders. Medical communications and publications will advise on how to best inform customers on the benefits and risks of the products, which is supported by clinical and economic data, and they also will manage the publications of clinical trials related to our products. Medical information will develop the content for MSL training and manage the home office call center. Health economics outcomes research will analyze the value of the product and its usefulness in clinical practice and compare its value to current competitors on the market. And lastly, medical direction and operations will manage the processes of the medical affairs team. Alright, so next we're going to talk about medical affairs involvement in the drug development process. So first, for the preclinical as well as the phase 1 and phase 2, our goal will be to analyze the market. So we will analyze the unmet needs from current medications for the diabetes market. We will also identify areas for further education for both patients and healthcare professionals. We will lastly describe the burden of disease based off of disability adjusted life year. And for phase 3 and filing, we will focus on separating our product. So this means, how does our product differ from current standards of care? as well as identify possible alternate and additional indications. And lastly, for post-launch/phase 4, we will focus on managing relationships with healthcare professionals, stakeholders, and also key opinion leaders. And this will include cooperating with legal, commercial, and regulatory in producing adequate commercialization of the product. Alright, so next we will be talking about our communication with internal and external stakeholders. So first, for internal stakeholders. Before launch, meetings will be facilitated by our department to develop launch strategy, tactics, and related training programs. And for the training program section, we will have a medical affairs metrics program, which is dashboard and content development is initiated for the company's medical affairs team members to monitor progress throughout the launch of Mulligan. And this will also be discussed further later. And lastly, for medical information, we will be training the sales and field team to be well versed in the clinical trials and relevant studies regarding the use of molybutide. And regarding to external stakeholders, first, upon completion of phase 3 and post-marketing studies, we will release results for the clinical trials to the external stakeholders 3 to 4 weeks after the end of the trials. For developing dossiers, we will include all pertinent clinical information in anticipation for physician needs and as well as mid-level practitioners, and this will also include off-label uses. And lastly, targeting KOLs. They will be identified within the diabetes market through medical journals and national organizations, and we will be discussing this further later as well. And in terms of recruiting key opinion leaders, we have some specific ways to execute. First, we will be attending conferences and meetings organized by the American Diabetes Association. We will also be reaching out to Diabetes Patient Advocacy Coalition, which is DPAC, which is an organization that supports the voices of diabetes patients. We will also be locating key researchers either from universities or from institutions that focus on diabetes, especially GLP-1. Lastly, we will also be using Mintel, which is a specialized marketing research company, for KOL mapping. And we will identify medical leaders or sponsors that have released or would like to release publications. And for medical science liaison training, we have a 4-step process in which we will be training our MSLs. So first, although we will be hiring trained therapeutic professionals, we want to train the MSLs specifically on Mulligan through PowerPoint presentations provided by the medical information team. Next, we will be clearly defining the engagement goal for each individual HCP and KOL. And next, we will be anticipating KOL needs and providing any further details and materials that the KOL may need. This means making sure that we have an up-to-date product dossier with thorough information on clinical trials and adverse drug events, which will be provided by the medical information team as well. And lastly, we will be requesting feedback from the KOLs, and we'll be acting upon that feedback if there's a concern for the product, and this includes adverse drug events. And next, I'll be talking about a value of the pharmacist and medical affairs department. So pharmacists can be of value in any number of roles under the medical affairs umbrella. For example, medical science liaison. As a credible individual with clinical knowledge, pharmacists are able to converse on a peer-to-peer level with prescribers and physicians. For medical information, they can become well-versed in clinical trials. They are able to analyze and present the key takeaways in a concise and accurate manner. In medical education, pharmacists work with stakeholders and key opinion leaders to develop useful continuing education programs and educating on prescribing behaviors and antibiotic stewardship initiatives. Lastly, in medical publications, we support the research initiatives of off-label indications for marketed products. Internally, pharmacists are able to communicate clinical information collected by clinical development from physicians and researchers to those on the commercial side. Externally, pharmacists can effectively communicate information collected during clinical development to key opinion leaders and practitioners. And next, we're going to have Dr. Peter Lee talk about the marketing department.
Hello, I'm Dr. Peter Lee. I'm the Director of Marketing, and I'll be going over the market research component. First, I'll be discussing the competitive landscape of the type 2 diabetes market. Global data reports that the type 2 diabetes market will double across 7 major markets in the US, UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Japan. Revenue is projected to grow from $26.8 billion to $64 billion by the year 2026. And among all the current diabetes drug classes, GLP-1 receptor agonists are projected to have the greatest growth. There are many GLP-1 agonists currently on the market, such as Victoza, Trulicity, and Tanzium. Victoza is the current market leader as it dominates the GLP-1 receptor agonist market with 60% market share. Trulicity is the next biggest competitor after Victoza, and lastly, Tanzium was recently discontinued in July 2017. We see Malagon as the dominant market leader by 2026, overtaking Victoza as the greatest market shareholder. This is a chart just depicting a list of the major GLP-1 receptor agonists on the market. You can see Malagon highlighted in orange, and in terms of pricing, Malagon will be priced on par with the other once-weekly GLP-1 agonists, but the official price is to be determined. This diagram represents the target audience for Malagon, which includes the patients, providers, and payers. From the patient's perspective, we took into consideration the impact Malagon would have on their daily lives. Malagon would provide easier administration in terms of frequency, which would also increase patient adherence. We also took into consideration how healthcare providers such as physicians, pharmacists, and nurses would utilize Malagon in disease management. Lastly, we took into consideration how payers would view Malagon as a value-based treatment that would provide solid results at an affordable price. Our brand strategy focuses on the major advantages of Malagon that addresses unmet needs in the current GLP-1 receptor agonist market. Malagon is seen as the longer-acting alternative to Victoza and has proven greater A1C reductions and weight reductions in comparison to Trulicity. As mentioned on the previous slide, in terms of pricing, Malagon will be priced on par with the other once-weekly GLP-1 receptor agonists, meaning that insurance coverage should pay a similar amount to other drugs in this class. We also expect copay savings card will be available to those without insurance coverage, similar to Victoza's instant savings card. We have designed the brand logo for our drug Malagon on the top right, and Malagon will also come as a pre-filled disposable Flex Touch pen. Our marketing platform for Malagon is 3-tiered. At the top tier, we have our sales force, which includes key account managers, sales managers, market researchers, end users, and legal representatives. In the middle tier, we have conferences, specifically focused on type 2 diabetes believers. Our sales force will partake in these conferences to exhibit Malagon to healthcare professionals. Lastly, on the bottom tier, we have journal advertisements. We will publish scientific articles that highlight the advantages of Malagon for type 2 diabetes patients on prestigious, well-respected medical scientific journals such as the New England Journal of Medicine, NCBI, Diabetes Care Journal, and the International Journal of Obesity. For post-market evaluation for Malagon, we will first follow our sales performance. This means tracking sales performance once Malagon officially enters the competitive market. Next, we will research emerging markets to see how future competitors in the type 2 diabetes market. Following that, we will adjust our sales strategy to meet the demands of market dynamics. This includes costs, changes in the market, and response to competing brands. Afterwards, we will advise in preparation for patent expiry on Malagon. And finally, we will prepare for positioning for future indications of Malagon.
Moving on to the last section, we'll be looking at the Health Economic Outcomes Research Plan.
So, for the objective, this is the highlight for the stakeholders, which include patients, insurers, employers, and providers, the overall value of molybutide. In this plan, we will target 3 main topics. First, we will be addressing the market need and opportunity of molybutide. This will show stakeholders why there is a need for this drug and how it can fill in the holes of current treatment therapies and guidelines. We will get into more detail in the later slides on how this will be highlighted, but this plan will include having an epi study, understanding the burden of uncontrolled type 2 diabetes, and why there is an unmet medical need. Then, going beyond the clinical trials and their endpoints, we will need to show the clinical effectiveness of molybutide. This is to see how molybutide can really improve health outcomes and impose a clinical benefit over existing therapies. To show this, we will have new endpoints on a standalone Phase 3 trial and also some additional post-marketing Phase 4 studies to track patients using molybutide and how it affects health outcomes. Lastly, we will look into how effectiveness of molybutide can impact the cost of treatment for patients and for healthcare overall. For the first part of marketing need and opportunity, the EPI study. This is to describe the scope of type 2 diabetes, the target population, which are patients who are uncontrolled with prior therapies, and we also want to look at the frequency of deaths and complications when diabetes is uncontrolled. We need to not only identify our target population, but we also want to quantify it so we can have a better understanding of the market size for molybutide. This will include looking at patients uncontrolled with prior insulin therapy, patients who cannot tolerate higher doses of insulin therapy but are still uncontrolled, patients who are contraindicated to GLP-1 therapy, and many more variables that fit into molybutide's target population. It is also important to quantify the use of the current diabetes medications. So looking into competitive intelligence tools, platforms such as Global Data and Bloomberg will be helpful in looking at yearly prescription sales and hospital use. With this data, this can help gauge the medication use and market size of type 2 diabetes. Next, we need to look at the clinical impact of the disease and its progressions. We can do this by looking at mortality rates. Right now, diabetes is the 7th leading cause of death in the U.S., but we also want to narrow down and look at mortality rates of patients specifically within the target population of molybutide. We also want to look at patients' comorbidities and other complications that can develop because of uncontrolled diabetes. These are important factors to consider when looking at the cost of treatment. And lastly, we want to identify the population at risk and which patient group molybutide can make the most impact, either it's for the patients in improving outcomes or improving cost effectiveness for payers. This would include looking into pharmacy insurance claims data, hospital medical records, like HCUP data, to understand the demographics and current status of the patient. Next, the burden of illness. The burden of illness can be measured with different strategies. We'll first have to look at average cost of treating a diabetic patient yearly. We also want to see what other cost factors into this total cost of treatment, like monitoring and diagnostic cost. Lastly, we want to see the frequency of different complications that occur in uncontrolled diabetic patients. This would add to the burden of illness to not just the patients, but to others, for example, to payers because of increased coverage costs and to employers because of lost work productivity. Speaking of employers, you may also want to try to gauge how much productivity is lost from a patient with uncontrolled diabetes. A survey could be sent out to employers and patients to better understand the disease burden on functionality. For the employers, you want to see how the disease affects their business and if improvements made to treating the disease could help the business overall. You also want to see how the patient feels and how the disease is holding them back and hindering them to work and function at full capacity. I know these are very subjective measures, but could still help stakeholders better understand that the burden of illness goes far beyond just the symptoms. There are other things to factor in and strengthen the stance that a new drug is needed to address this problem, like molybutide. Lastly, in the marketing need and opportunity section, it is important to highlight there's a need for this medication. There are a lot of diabetic medications on the market right now, but why is molybutide different? How would this drug address the treatment gaps in current therapies right now? To better understand the gaps in current therapies, we can ask key opinion leaders and physicians either through meetings, phone, email interviews, and or surveys. Below are some sample questions we have thought of that could help understand the treatment holes within the current therapies today. Some potential questions include, what are the treatment barriers and restrictions that stop providers from prescribing a GLP agonist and or insulin therapy to type 2 diabetic patients? What are some flaws in the treatment guidelines, and does it exclude any patient groups you have experienced or treated? We could also use patient-reported surveys to ask if they have been adherent to their medications and what is stopping them from being adherent. We can also see how they feel about, especially with their quality of life with current treatment regimens. With this data, this can help better understand how patients feel about their current treatments and if a better treatment is needed. We can also look into the databases to see for patients what current prescription medications they're on, including which, of course, the diabetic medication, and also the frequency of readmission rates, hospitalizations, and emergency room visits for type 2 diabetes patients. There are some restrictions to this since the records are anonymous due to the HIPAA regulations, and it would be hard to have enough data parameters to see which patient is uncontrolled and which patient is controlled. But nevertheless, this could tell you the prevalence of the patient population and highlight that there are patients who are not adequately treated with the current therapies. Thus, there is a medical need needed.
Next, we will be assessing molybutide's clinical benefit and observe patient-reported outcomes by doing a standalone prospective study. This study design is used because it is more flexible than others, and it is well suited in evaluating real-world effectiveness. It is a prospective, placebo-controlled, randomized, and double-blinded study. The target population, treatment arms, and primary-secondary endpoints will be the same as those in Phase 3 clinical trials. New endpoints that we looked at and tracked patients for 2 years was on their routine physician visits, hospitalizations, drug refills, and adverse event reporting. Also, we collected data on patient reporting of any confirmed hypoglycemic events, treatment satisfaction, and DQOL questionnaire results. We also looked at Phase 4 post-marketing study to measure real-world evidence. This was a retrospective study on hospital records, lab, and insurance claims data. We compared patient population on Molagon to those on GLP agonist and insulin therapy to account for patients' age, comorbidities, and number of hospitalizations, and cost of stay, length of stay, mortality rate, and number of prescriptions. We also looked at how each medication impacted on the patient by looking at the DQOL questionnaire. To analyze Molagon's impact on cost of healthcare, we did a cost-effectiveness analysis. First, we performed ICER, which means incremental cost-effectiveness ratio, to compare Molagon to other drugs in long-term cost-effectiveness. We also extrapolated clinical trial data to see the long-term efficacy of Molagon for 3 to 5 years and how this reduces patients' treatment costs compared to other drugs, such as complication costs and hospital readmission cost. Also, we established some key comparison benchmarks such as HbA1c levels, fasting blood glucose, 7-9-point SMBG, and further on the list to evaluate efficacy of Molagon. Next, we used the budget impact model to assess Molagon's impact and its affordability to the healthcare budget. We looked into the prevalence of the disease, rate of treatment, and market share of different GLP-1 analogs. We looked at the unit cost, prescriptions sold, and projected sales as presented on global data and Bloomberg to estimate market share. We also identified cost offset to see how much medical costs are saved from adding this new drug on the market. Overall complication rates and readmission rates and costs are factors that we looked into. For more transparency, we also calculated the per member per month cost to numerically determine the overall treatment cost of Molagon and evaluate its significance when added to the existing market. Thank you for listening to our presentation. Molagon is a promising drug for type 2 diabetic patients who are uncontrolled within the current therapies. With proper development, we hope Molagon will bring value to the current market, and also we continue to see pharmacists playing a big role in the drug development and also to our company's success. So we have a lot of work to do, so until next time.